No, today we're in a series, Are We There Yet? And we're in part 5 of this series, which I thought about this. I think part 5, I think that makes it officially the longest series that I've done here personally at the Co, which I just think is ironic, given the name. So some of you may be asking yourself in this series, are we there yet, bro? Are we there yet? But hey, here's what we've talked about in this. We've been saying this for 4 weeks now, going on 5, right? In our lives, right? There's so many times and so many moments where we find ourselves in a season of waiting, when we find ourselves trying to figure things out, we find ourselves looking for the next thing in our life to come, right? And if there's one thing that we all hate, help me out, there's one thing that we all hate to wait, right? We all hate to wait, right? We avoid waiting like the plague. We pay extra, right, at Valley Fair or Disney World or wherever we can to skip the line. We do Target pickups in my household. Anybody else a Target pickup family or a Walmart pickup family? We're a straight up pickup family. I haven't seen the inside of a store in a really long time. You can do returns now from your car at Target. It's crazy. You know what I mean? But the last thing I want to do is go stand at customer service and wait in line with a bunch of other people at customer service, because we all hate to wait, and we'll do everything that we can to avoid waiting. But we've said in this series, hey, there are actually moments and seasons of our life where whether we want to or not, whether we like it or not, whether we choose it or not, we are forced to do nothing but wait. And so I'm just going to tell you, today's message, today's conversation, really is specifically, as we wrap up the series, for those of us who have found ourselves waiting, not just for a little bit, but those of us who have found ourselves waiting for something for a while. And maybe you've been waiting for a while for something good to show up in your life that you've been waiting for, you've been anticipating, hoping something good, that you've been working towards and waiting for it to come. Maybe you've been in a season that's been very difficult, and you've just been waiting, you don't even care what the next season is, as long as it's not this one, and you've just been waiting for this season to end, right? But it's been a while for you, and you found yourself waiting for longer than it feels like you should have been waiting. And maybe the longer you've waited, right, you find that people start telling you what they think that you should do, and maybe you even find yourself confused about what you ought to do in this season of your life, particularly this season of waiting. Because here's the thing about seasons of waiting, right? The longer the season of waiting lasts, the more opinions people actually have for you, right? The longer it lasts, the more opinions people have. You found this to be true so many times in your life, right? You're sitting in a season for a while that just feels like it's never going to end. And then all of a sudden, everybody else wants a voice into your life and into your season, right? Maybe you've been single for a while, but then maybe searching for the right person to come into your life. And after a while, right, people just start telling you what they think you need to do to move beyond singleness in your life. They're like, hey, I know you've tried these 3 apps, maybe you should try this 4th one. Hey, I know you've dated this person and this person, maybe you should date this person. They even start bringing people to you, right, to tell you who you might ought to date to get past that season or move forward in that season of your life, right? Or maybe in your marriage, you found yourself sitting in a season of your marriage. It just feels like it just won't end. It feels tense. It feels tight. Tight. It feels difficult, right? You feel like you can't move past it, right? And after a while, if you've told a couple of friends about this, eventually they start telling you what they think you ought to do to get past that season of your marriage, or maybe in your finances, or even in your career, right? You've sat in one position for a while and you've been waiting for the next thing to come in life, the next opportunity to come in life, the next position to show up in your career. But you haven't got there, and it's taken longer than you thought it would. And after a while, people start giving you their opinion on your career and what they think you should do, and maybe the skills that you should get, or the degree that you should go get, or all the things, right? And it has to be a 4-year degree, right, Brad? Can't be got to be a 4-year. Totally kidding. If you're online and you missed the discussion question, you have no idea what we're talking about there, right? But they start pouring in all of these different opinions about what you ought to do in this season of your life to move forward into the next season of your life. Now, all this gets a little bit tricky because all these decisions come in a disguise, and they come in a little disguise called advice. Hey, can I just give you some advice, right? Which advice is like an opinion wearing a tuxedo. It just sounds a little bit better. It just looks a little bit more formal. But at the end of the day, it's kind of the same thing. And we tend to bucket all of these thoughts. We tend to bucket all these perspectives into 2 kind of categories of advice. We say it's good advice, and then there's bad advice, right? There's good advice, and there's bad advice. But the challenge is, come on, you've seen this. Sometimes the good advice turns out bad, and the bad advice somehow just miraculously turns out good, right? For example, if this were 2009, and I told you, hey, there's this new thing called cryptocurrency, and you should really invest all of your money in cryptocurrency. You'd be like, bro, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. That's terrible advice, right? But so many of us wish we'd taken that advice. You know what I mean? Like somehow it turned out and it worked out good. But if this were 2022 and I looked at you and I said, hey, you should invest all of your money into Bitcoin. That's a great, just put it all in Bitcoin, right? A lot of us would have said, hey, you know what? Like Bitcoin's doing great. That's actually really good advice. And a few months later, you would have lost the majority of it. You know, like what was good advice actually, or looked like good advice, turned out to be bad. And what seemed like bad advice in the moment actually turned out to be good. And so how do we actually distinguish between what's good advice and what's bad advice? What's the right direction? What's the incorrect direction? What's wise? What's unwise with all of these voices and all these opinions and all this advice coming into our life? And the challenge also with all of this is when it comes to advice, all advice is limited. Every piece of advice that someone gives you, every piece of advice that you give is limited. But all this piece of advice coming to you is limited by the experience of the person who's giving it to you, particularly their own waiting season, the experience that they've had in their own season of waiting, right? Or maybe, just maybe, the experience they've had watching someone else's season of waiting. But the one thing that they've never experienced is your waiting season. And your waiting season might have some similarities, but it's not the same. And your waiting season might have some commonalities, but it doesn't hold everything in common with the things that they've experienced, right? And so you get all these perspectives from other people's seasons, and then you try to put that against your own waiting season and put that against your own life, which is nuanced and personal to you, and go, which of these things actually fits my season right now in my life? And ultimately, eventually in all this, right, you can start to feel, if you're anything like me, you can start to feel confused by all of these perspectives that are coming your way. Maybe even start to feel disoriented, trying to figure out, I don't even know which direction is the right direction. And depending on the people speaking in, you might actually at some point start to feel foolish. That you're still in the season that you're in, pursuing the thing that you're pursuing or waiting for the thing that you've been waiting for a while. Several years ago, I was in my late 20s. And I was in a season of life where I knew that a career shift was coming, but I didn't know exactly what it was going to look like. But I'd been waiting for a while to make that shift and for that shift to kind of come for me. And there was a particular role, a particular leadership role within organizations that I felt like was the right next step for me. In fact, I'd processed it a lot. I felt like, man, this is the thing that I'm supposed to do next, is this particular type of leadership role within organizations. I felt like that's what I was supposed to do. But I had spent a while trying to find the right fit for that and kind of pursuing different opportunities, and the right opportunity hadn't shown up yet. And quite honestly, I was getting pretty frustrated and pretty tired of waiting. And so I called a variety of people in that season, but one of the people I called was a mentor of mine who had been a really strong voice in my life. I mean, he had coached me and counseled me through some different seasons in my life. He had coached me and counseled me when I got married. He was a pivotal voice in my life. I called him. I said, hey, here's what I'm processing. Here's what I'm trying to figure out. Here's what I'm up against. I was in my late 20s at the time, and he said, hey, listen, he goes, I think that the thing that you want to do is something that you could do. He goes, I think you've got all the skills for it. He said, I think you'd do a great job at it. He said, I think you'd be fantastic. He goes, the only challenge is, he goes, I don't think anybody's going to give you that job. He said, because I don't think you're old enough for anybody to look at you and feel like they could give you that job. And quite honestly, in that moment, I felt confused. I don't really know what to make of all that. I felt disoriented in my own waiting season, trying to figure out, am I even pursuing the right direction? Is my sense of north even on point in this moment? And I certainly felt foolish for even thinking that maybe that could be the next step for me. Now, I'd be willing to bet that at some point in your life, you've been in a season of your own where you've been trying to figure out what the next thing is. And the next thing didn't come fast enough, and it didn't come when it was supposed to. And at some point along the way, people were pouring into you and speaking into you and saying things about you or to you, trying to help, trying to give good advice, right? But all of those voices and all those perspectives left you feeling just more confused, more disoriented, and maybe even a little bit foolish for still being in the season that you're in. I'd be willing to bet for some of us, you feel that right now. So how do we, in a season of waiting, how do we actually sort through all this stuff? And how do we actually know what advice to take while we wait? Now, to help us with that question, we're going to dive this morning into a story within Scripture. It's found in the book of 1 Samuel, which is in the Old Testament. We're going to dive into that story. And quite honestly, it's a story that I'm just going to tell you out of the gate. I'm willing to bet just about everybody in this room is familiar in some way or another with this story. Whether you grew up in church your whole life or you've never been to church before, I'm willing to bet that in some point or another, you've ran into some piece of the story in a way that you're somewhat familiar with. It's the story of David and Goliath. Now, most of us, if not all of us, are like massively familiar with David and Goliath, right? David, story of a boy or a teenager, David, who comes to a battle line and he sees that this giant from the enemy has come across the battle line and challenged all of the Israelites in his nation, of all their military, challenged for one person to come out and fight against him. And David, being a teenager, the youngest one who's there, steps out to fight against Goliath and ultimately conquers Goliath. Many of you are familiar with this story, and you're familiar with this story as a story of an underdog. What an underdog can do in a moment of difficulty when it seems like everything is stacked against him. And it is a story of an underdog. But it's also a story of a teenager who recognized when his season of waiting had come to an end before anyone else in his life who was speaking into his life recognized that season had come to an end. The story begins likely several years before David encounters Goliath, when David finds himself at home. And his home, his family receives a visit from a guy named Samuel, who's a prophet within the nation of Israel. Now, when a prophet comes to your house in Israel back in this time, thousands of years ago, that's a really big deal. Samuel in this moment represents the voice of God to the people of Israel. And when the voice of God shows up to your house, everyone starts to pay attention. And God had said to Samuel, he said, hey, there's a king in Israel right now, but there's going to be a new king in Israel one day. And he said, I want you to go and anoint the next king of Israel. And he had sent Samuel to David's house. And so Samuel arrives, and David's father meets him there, and Samuel asks to see all of David's father, Jesse's sons, right? He wants to see all the boys who live in this house to see which of them might be the next great king of Israel. And so Jesse, David's father, Jesse brings out many of his sons, and he puts them in front of Samuel. In fact, he puts 6 sons in front of Samuel. And each time he puts another son in front of Samuel, God says to Samuel, no, that's not him. No, that's not him. No, that's not him. To the point that he kind of exhausted everybody that had been brought to this moment. And Samuel says to Jesse, Jesse, are all your sons here? And Jesse says to Samuel, hey, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. Like, we didn't even invite him. You want us to go get him? Like, he's taking care of the sheep. And Samuel says, send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. So Jesse calls for David, the youngest of 7 sons. And David comes to meet Samuel. The author tells us that Samuel then took the horn of oil and anointed him, David, in the midst of his brothers. Which, just real quick, can you just imagine being one of David's brothers in this moment? The voice of God just told you no. And then your kid brother just got the biggest yes of his life. You know what I mean? Right there in front of you. Like, you're going to feel that in that moment. Now, this feels like a really big day in David's life. This feels like the kind of day that's going to change everything for David. This feels like the kind of thing that's going to put a ton of things into motion for David. This feels like the kind of day that's going to change every day for the rest of his life. But the reality is, this is just one day, and then that's it. Nothing else really happens for a while. David ends up going back and keeping sheep. Why? Because there's already a king in Israel. And so David keeps sheep for quite some time, and quite some time passes. And then in time, that king of Israel finds himself at odds with a neighboring group of people called the Philistines. And their border begins to be encroached upon. The author tells us this. He says that the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. Now, Socoh is a border city or border town right on the edge of Israel's border at this time. And the Philistines, it's a disputed town. The Philistines are coming and say, hey, we want to dispute the border. We're actually going to take on more land. This is actually a border dispute around the nation of Israel, which has been happening for, as you know, thousands of years at this point. But the Philistines come, they encroach upon the border. I love this note from the author. The author says, which belongs to Judah, which is a region of Israel this time. Basically, the author's saying, hey, no, it's ours, you know. He says, hey, there's this border dispute that develops. The Philistines come to the town of Soko. And so all of the military of Israel is mobilized to the spot to defend and to protect the border. And David's brothers, 3 of David's brothers actually go, and they join the military, and they join up with the current king at that time, and they go out to meet the Philistines there. And Jesse, David's father, sends David out to this military encampment to check on his brothers and to take food for his 3 brothers. And so David goes and takes the food there. And while he's there, a giant named Goliath, this guy is 9 feet tall, the text tells us, right? 9 feet tall. This giant named Goliath has started coming out every day and calling to the people of Israel, the military of Israel, and saying, hey, if one of you will come and fight the one of me, we'll find out from that fight between the 2 of us which one of us is going to represent our nations, right? And which one of us is going to lead our nations into victory in this battle. In other words, this hand-to-hand combat is going to define the victory for the rest of our armies. So we'll spare a lot of bloodshed in this hand-to-hand combat in this moment, right? And the winner, kind of a winner-takes-all situation here. And Goliath has been coming out every day and saying this. And David comes and he hears Goliath saying this, and he hears the people talking about Goliath saying this. In fact, he hears the soldiers saying this. The text tells us, the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And these soldiers are saying, the king will enrich the man who kills him, Goliath, with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. Now, David recognizes, wow, that's a lot on the line there. Like, this is a pretty big deal. And so David asks again. David says to the men who stood by him, he says, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? What shall be done for him, the one who goes and faces and fights and kills Goliath? What shall be done? Now, why is David so interested in this moment? Not just in Goliath, and not just in what Goliath is saying, but also interested in specifically what will happen to the person who kills Goliath and what may be done for the person who kills Goliath. I think it's because David recognizes that in ancient cultures like this one, there are only 2 ways that a new king rises to the throne. Either one, he's the son of a king, right? The prince, of which David is not. Or 2, in one way or another, he becomes some type of a war hero to gain the influence and the respect of a people that would move and propel him towards the throne. I think David recognizes this. And he recognizes that this could actually be the moment when everything that he's been waiting for starts moving into motion, and everything he's been sitting and readying himself for actually gets begun. So David's older brother actually hears David asking all these questions, and he actually gets angry with David. He looks at David, he says, why have you come down? Like, what are you even doing here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. His older brother's doing 2 things here. One, he's assuming that David's being opportunistic in this moment. The same brother who watched David be anointed years prior assumes that he's being opportunistic. And second, right, he defines David by the waiting season that he's been in this whole time. Now, you know what this is like because you've had people in your life who could only see you and define you by the season that you had been in for a while. They only saw you, right, as single and waiting. They only saw you as entry level. They only saw you as job searching. They only saw you as trying to figure out what you want to do with your life. They only saw you as a season that you'd been in. And that's the way that Eliab looks at his brother David. And David says back to his brother, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him, his brother, toward another, and he spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before, what shall be done for the man who kills him? What shall be done for the man who kills him? And David asked so much that a buzz actually begins to develop within this military encampment. And word of David's questioning actually makes its way to King Saul. And King Saul calls David before him. And David says to Saul in that moment, he says, let no man's heart fail because of him, Goliath, your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul looks back at this teenage boy. He says to him, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. He was a man before you could even think about being a man. You're not qualified for this. You're not ready for this. You're not prepared for this. No. And David, in a moment, where most of us would have gone, yeah, you're probably right. Yeah, you know what? That sounds wise. Yeah, you know what? He's pretty big, and I've never done this before. Yeah, you know what? That's good advice. David, in that moment, actually begins to make his case to King Saul. And when he begins to make his case, he says something that's so subtle, yet so meaningful at the beginning of his case. Watch this. Watch what he says. David says to Paul, he says, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. Now, time out real quick, David. What do you mean, used to keep sheep? Like, you mean yesterday? Like 5 minutes ago? Tomorrow? Like, what do you mean used to? He goes, yeah, I used to. And David goes, no, that was something that happened. But David recognizes this is the moment where my season starts to change. This is the moment where everything starts to shift. And now that I'm here, I can actually look back and see all the ways that keeping sheep has prepared me for this moment. And he goes on to Saul and actually begins to read his resume to Saul. He says, when I was keeping sheep and there was a lion or a bear and it took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be killed like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. He goes, everyone else thinks that I was just keeping sheep. Everyone else thinks that I was just sitting in the field all day. But what was actually happening in that moment, I maybe didn't see it then, but I recognize it now, what was actually happening in that moment is I was preparing for a moment that I didn't know it would come. I didn't know what it would look like. I didn't know how I would get there. But when it came, I can look back and see all the ways that I prepared for this moment. And my brother thinks I'm just a sheep keeper. But he has no idea what happened with me in those fields. And you look at me and you think I'm a teenager. But you have no idea what happened to me in those fields. And I used to keep sheep. But now I'm ready. And Saul looks back at David and he says, go. And the Lord be with you. Now, Saul also in this moment does what every one of us would want to do for David in this moment. He wants to help him in the way that seems wise and best for him to help him. So Saul clothed David with his armor, his own armor, and put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And David tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off, right? This is Saul, who's a king, who's been experienced in battle. This isn't his first rodeo. Looking at David, who's never fought a day in his life, and saying, hey, the best thing you should probably do in this moment is armor up, because you're going to need it. And David, who's never touched a sword or knowledge in a day in his life, looks back and Saul and goes, listen, I know that's good advice. I know that makes sense, but that's not how I've been prepared for this moment. So the author tells us David took his staff in his hand, the same staff that he had held likely for years in those fields. And he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine Goliath. And the rest was history. David took a rock from that pouch. He slung it toward Goliath's head. Goliath falls down. David runs up, not just with his staff, but now takes Goliath's own sword, cuts off his head, holds it up, and inspires every soldier of Israel to fight. And at the end of that battle, the soldiers return. And they go back through most of Israel, through much of Israel, marching all back to their own towns, like a military parade in many of these moments. And they're walking through these towns, and the author tells us that in every town in Israel, women came out with tambourines, singing and dancing. And you know what they sang? They said, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David, his name throughout all of Israel, his tens of thousands. And this was the moment that initiated David's campaign for kingship, that one day would move him to become the next great king of Israel. This was the turning point. This was the end of one season and the start of a new one. And here's the thing that I love so much about this. David never kept sheep again. So how was David? After years of waiting, after years of sitting in a field, after years of being promised one thing but never actually seeing it develop into anything, so confident to take his right next step. He held on to God's promise. Watch this. He held on to God's promise from years ago. And he paid attention to his preparation. And when his older brother said, hey, you're just a sheep keeper, David said, hey, you have no idea. You must have forgotten what happened back in our living room. He resisted that identity. He held on to God's promise in that moment. When Saul says, hey, you should probably wear armor, David says, yeah, that makes sense. But when I look at the ways that I've been prepared for this moment, it doesn't make as much sense. He held on to God's promise, and he paid attention to his preparation. And David's example for us offers us a filter in our own seasons of waiting. When everyone in our life seems to have an opinion about who we should be and what we should do and what the right step for you is to take, David's example offers us a filter. When everyone in the world seems to have an opinion for you. Listen, God's promise and preparation points the way forward. God's promise and preparation points the path forward for you. So as you consider advice in your season of waiting, as you consider the perspectives of so many people in your life, and let me say this, that's a good thing to do. You should seek wisdom. You should seek perspective. You should ask people who have been there before in some way, shape, or form. But as you do, ask yourself, of all the things that they're saying to you, is it in line with God's promise for me? Is it in line with the things that he's put in my heart? Is it in line with the dreams that he's given to me? Is it in line with the sense of calling and purpose that he's offered to me before? And is it in line with how God's been preparing me through this season of waiting? Does it actually line up with the ways that he's been getting me ready for the next season? And when you've considered those two things, so many other perspectives and opinions start to fall to the wayside. And you begin to find in the center of all of that the path forward for you. So, as you consider perspectives and advice in your life, let me give you 3 questions real quick that I think can be helpful for us as we discern the path forward in our own lives. Run advice, run perspective, run opinions through this filter. First off, can the person who's giving this to me, can they see where I'm headed or just where I've been? Do they actually see where I'm going next, or they only see me in the season that I'm in right now? Second, can they see beyond what's worked for them? And it's good to hear the perspectives and advice of others, but can they see beyond their own experiences to see what might actually be relevant and meaningful in my own life as well? And lastly, do they acknowledge that the Lord is with me? In the same way that David acknowledged moment after moment that the Lord was with him in each step that he took. Does the person speaking in to me acknowledge that there's a force greater than me, and there's something bigger than them that's actually influencing and affecting and moving me forward in this season, in this moment in my life? And do they acknowledge the Lord is with me in this season? No. Before we wrap up, I just want to share a couple things real quick when it comes to preparation, when it comes to promise, that I think are pretty significant. In fact, I'd feel kind of irresponsible if we didn't talk about these real quick before we wrap up. So let me say this real quick about preparation. Many of you are in seasons of preparation right now in your own life. And I'm just going to say this. One of the best things I believe you can do when you find yourself in a season of waiting, and when you find yourself in a season of preparation, is that times to actually intentionally extend your season of waiting for the purpose of actually intentionally extending your season of preparation. When I was in my early to mid-20s, it was an opportunity for me. I was looking at a couple different career opportunities, job opportunities, and there was actually an opportunity that was presented to me to go and do that role that I was talking about earlier that I want to do later in life. I had an opportunity like in my early 20s to actually step into that role and that position. And it was a thing that I had been like waiting for. I'd already waited a couple years for it, so I felt like, man, this is like the right time for me to step into this and go do it. And then I also had another job opportunity that was very similar to the job I already had. It was pretty much, it looked on paper like it was pretty much the same type of thing. And so when I got all of the information about these two roles, it seemed very obvious to me that I should not do what I'd already done and go do the thing that I had always wanted to do. And so I called Emily at the time. We were dating. We weren't even engaged, I don't think, at that moment. I called her and said, hey, I got all the information about these two opportunities. Pretty obvious. Going to go do the thing that I've always felt like I was supposed to do, the thing I felt like was promised to me, the thing I felt like was right for me to do. And Emily, in all of her wisdom, said, hey, I think you need to take the other opportunity a little bit more seriously than you are right now. Because even though it looks like what you've already done, it might actually teach you some things that you haven't learned yet. And it might actually prepare you in ways that you haven't been fully prepared over the last couple of years. And then one day when you go and do the thing that you feel like you should do and feel like the thing you feel like you're waiting for, you might be more ready for it then than you are today. I'll tell you, she was absolutely right in that moment. When Emily and I were we were friends before we started dating. Emily was at a church, and she was kind of engaged with the message that day. And the pastor was in the middle of a series on dating and love and marriage, and he encouraged everybody in the room at the time who was single. He said, hey, look, everybody in the room who was single, he said, hey, one of the best things I feel like you could do in this moment, if you're currently single and not with anybody, he goes, take 12 months and commit yourself to being single for 12 additional months, which is like the worst thing you can say to somebody who's single and searching. You know what I mean? It's like, no, just take yourself off the market for 12 months, right? And focus on becoming the kind of person that you hope to be when you step into the right relationship for you. And Emily in that moment, we were just friends at the time. Emily in that moment said she took the challenge. So I'm going to take 12 months off from dating. 10 months later, I asked Emily if she would date me. She said, sorry, bro, you got to wait 2 months, you know? But she recognized, hey, one of the best things I could do for me in this moment is be fully dedicated to this season of preparation and intentionally extend that season of preparation to fully become the person that I hope to be when this season of waiting ends. Now, some of you hear that and you go, that's crazy. What if the right person comes along in the middle of that waiting period, right? The right person, they'll wait. One of the best things that you can do in a season of waiting is actually to intentionally extend your season of waiting for the sake of additional preparation so that when you walk out of this season and into the next, you're ready for the next in ways that you're not ready today, and maybe even in ways that you don't even realize that you're not ready today. Now, let me say this real quick before we wrap up about God's promises to us. Part of understanding how to filter advice is actually knowing and being in tune with what God has promised you and called you to and put within your heart and what he's moving you towards in the next season of your life. But here's the challenge. Most people go their whole lives without actually being aware of what God's promises are for them. Because so many people, at some point or another, either stepped away from faith or settled for a version of faith that didn't actually involve a personal relationship with the God of the universe. And the thing about the story we worked through today, in David's season, right, God primarily spoke through prophets and primarily spoke through one or two or a handful of people at a time. But we believe, if you've been around the code for a while, we believe that because of the work that Jesus did on our behalf, we actually are invited into a personal relationship with the God of the universe. And that you and I actually have the ability to hear directly from him about what he hopes for in our lives, what he desires for you, and the things that he actually wants to promise you in this season and for the next season. But so many of us have settled for a version of faith that actually doesn't include that at all. And many of us actually came up and were raised in a version of faith that actually said, hey, you're not really qualified to hear God's voice. And if you want to hear God's voice, you got to hear it from somebody else, right? And so I'm going to say this. We don't have time to tackle all this in one Sunday. But over the next 4 weeks, we're going to actually dive into a new series. We're calling it Original Faith. And this series is designed to help all of us in the room begin to actually detangle the version of faith that maybe we were given at some point in our life. Maybe detach some of the things that actually keep us from experiencing faith as it was originally intended to be experienced, and from having a personal relationship with the God of the universe in the way that we were designed to have a relationship with him. So my encouragement to you, if there's a piece of you that goes, I'm not really sure what God's promises are for me in this season, hang with us for 4 more weeks. Because I'm telling you, as we lean into this together, I think we're all going to find ourselves further down the road in our relationship with Jesus, further down the road in our relationship with the God of the universe, and more directly connected with him in a way that we can receive his promises for us. So I hope you'll join us for that series. We'll kick that off next Sunday. Let me say this real quick. As we wrap up today, I want to pray for us. And after we pray for us, we're actually going to move into a time of communion. We don't do this every week at the Co. We do this fairly often at the Co. Right? It's a time of communion that's actually designed for us to reflect on what Jesus did on our behalf, to open up a pathway in a relationship directly with the God of the universe. And so in just a moment, I'm going to share a little bit more about what that's going to look like. But I'll just tell you now, the way this is going to work, I'm going to pray, and then the band's going to come up. And after the band comes up, I'm going to say amen, right? And the band's going to lead us in a song. And as they lead us in a song, you're going to find members of our board down here with stations for communion with elements, right? And if you would like to participate in communion, we practice an open table at the Co. If you'd like to participate in communion, I'm going to invite you at any point during that song just to come down and grab the bread and the juice. You can take those back to your seat and continue to sing. And at the end of the song, Katie will come back up and facilitate together for all of us to take those elements together. Come, let's pray together, and then we'll go into communion. God, I thank you for the ways that you've been at work in our lives for the last 5 weeks. God, I thank you for the ways that you've been speaking to so many of us about our own seasons of waiting. God, for those of us at the end of this series who find ourselves going, man, like I'm just ready for it to end, like I'm ready for it to be over. God, would you give us patience that we haven't had before? Would you give us the willingness to pause a little bit longer? Would you give us an openness to however you might be preparing us right now? God, for those of us who find ourselves going, man, I don't even know what I'm waiting for. I don't even know what the next thing is. God, would you begin to speak to our hearts? God, would you help us to find a relationship with you that we didn't even know we could have? Would you help us to discover the things that you desire for us, not our own plans, but your plans and your promises for us? Father, would you show us the way forward in this season? God, as we move into a time of communion, would you let this be a moment where we actually get to pause and reflect on the work that you've done on our behalf? God, when we put that in perspective, many of the seasons in our life feel so much smaller, so less weighty, so less important. We recognize what you've done on our behalf when you gave your life for us. We thank you for that. We look forward to seeing you at work in our seasons of waiting. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.